If you translate this, I respect you. The manager mocked the black waiter and lost his voice. Tyrone Jackson felt the weight of the stares and cruel comments every day at the Skyline restaurant, the most refined establishment in Atlanta. For 3 years, he had worked as a waiter, enduring the constant humiliations from manager Brandon Miller, who never missed a chance to belittle him in front of customers. That Thursday afternoon, when the Japanese executives from Eastern Auto entered the main dining room for an important business dinner, Brandon saw another opportunity to flaunt his arrogance. He approached Tyrone with a cruel smile and said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Tyrone, let me handle this table. You can barely speak English properly, let alone understand these Japanese folks. Go clean the back tables instead." Tyrone felt his blood boil. 3 years putting up with these kinds of remarks. 3 years being treated as if he were incompetent just for being black and working as a waiter. But this time would be different. He walked over to the Japanese executive's table, bowed respectfully, and said perfectly in Japanese, "Good afternoon, gentlemen. Welcome to the Skyline. It will be an honor to serve you today." The silence that followed was deafening. The Japanese executives smiled in surprise and responded enthusiastically, also in Japanese. Brandon turned pale, unable to utter a word, while Tyrone conversed fluently with the guests, explaining the menu and the restaurant's specialties. The look of shock on the manager's face was something Tyrone would remember forever. The other waiters stopped working to watch the scene. No one knew Tyrone spoke Japanese. In fact, no one at the restaurant knew anything about his real academic background. To everyone there, he was just another employee who needed the job to get by. Brandon tried to recover from the embarrassment, but the Japanese executives were already charmed by Tyrone. They insisted that only he serve them throughout the entire meal. The manager had to swallow his anger and pretend everything was normal, but Tyrone noticed the furious glances sent his way. "How did you learn Japanese?" Betty, the restaurant's most senior waitress, asked discreetly when Tyrone passed by the kitchen. "It's a long story," he replied, avoiding details. The truth was far more complex than anyone could imagine. While serving, Tyrone overheard an interesting conversation among the Japanese executives. They were impressed not only by his fluency in the language, but also by his knowledge of Japanese business culture. They remarked among themselves how rare it was to find someone in the United States who mastered so many nuances of the language. Brandon, who had been watching from a distance, was visibly unsettled. His authority had been publicly challenged, and he didn't know how to react. He approached the table, pretending to check if everything was all right, but the Japanese barely acknowledged him, engrossed in their conversation with Tyrone. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now back to the story. When the dinner ended, the executives left a generous tip specifically for Tyrone and asked to speak with the restaurant's owner. They wanted to praise the exceptional service they'd received. Brandon tried to intercept the compliment, but they were clear. They were talking specifically about the waiter who spoke Japanese. "We need to talk," Brandon said to Tyrone as soon as the guests left. His voice carried a restrained anger that made his words sharp. Tyrone followed the manager to the back office of the restaurant. The walls were decorated with photos of the establishment over the years, excellence awards, and certificates that Brandon made a point of displaying like personal trophies. "Since when do you speak Japanese?" asked Brandon, trying to keep a professional tone but failing miserably. "Since forever," Tyrone replied calmly. "You never asked about my background before hiring me." The simple answer left Brandon even more irritated. He had hired Tyrone based solely on the urgent need for staff and the prejudice that a black man looking for work as a waiter shouldn't have much formal education. "Don't give me that. Where did you learn Japanese?" Brandon insisted. "At university," Tyrone answered, keeping his voice steady. "I have a degree in linguistics with a specialization in simultaneous translation." Brandon felt as if the ground had vanished beneath his feet. For 3 years, he had humiliated and underestimated someone who likely had more academic credentials than he did. The revelation was like a punch to the gut. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" Brandon asked, his voice now quieter. "Because you never wanted to know," Tyrone replied. and because I needed the job. It's not easy finding work in translation, especially when people judge based on appearances. Tyrone remembered the day he was let go from the translation company where he worked. The business had shut down during the economic crisis, leaving dozens of qualified professionals unemployed. He had searched for months for a new opportunity in the field, but interviews always ended the same way, with vague excuses and promises to call back that never came. The job at Skyline Restaurant had come when Tyrone was desperate. His savings had run out, and he needed to pay rent for his tiny studio in Bankhead. His mother, Miss Dorothy, was sick and depended on expensive medication. There was no time for pride or explanations about his academic background. Brandon left the office without another word, leaving Tyrone alone with his thoughts. The waiter looked out the small window overlooking the alley behind the restaurant and sighed deeply. The truth was starting to come out, and he didn't know if it would be good or bad for his future there. The next day, the atmosphere in the restaurant was tense. Brandon avoided Tyrone, but his hostility was palpable. The other employees whispered among themselves, curious about what had happened the night before. "Tyrone, do you really speak Japanese?" asked Margaret, the receptionist, during a break. "Yes, and a few other languages too," he replied, offering no further details. The answer only sparked more curiosity. Margaret was a 55-year-old woman who had worked at the restaurant longer than anyone else. She had seen many waiters come and go, but never anyone like Tyrone. There had always been something different about him, a refinement in his speech and manner that didn't match the job he held. During the afternoon shift, a group of French tourists arrived. Brandon, still unsettled by the previous day's events, decided to test Tyrone again. He approached the table and said loudly, "Tyrone, come here. Let's see if you can understand these French folks too." The sarcasm was unmistakable. Brandon was trying to humiliate Tyrone once more, hoping he would fail and lose the credibility he'd gained the day before. Tyrone walked to the table calmly and greeted the tourists in flawless French. Not only did he discuss the menu with them, but he also gave tips about tourist spots in Atlanta and recommended other restaurants in the city for different occasions. The French visitors were delighted by his attentiveness and knowledge. Brandon watched everything with a mix of anger and disbelief. Every word Tyrone spoke in French felt like a stab at his pride. How had he been so blind? How had he underestimated that man so much? The situation worsened when the French tourists asked Tyrone about his background. He modestly explained that he had studied linguistics in college. They were impressed and questioned why someone with such knowledge was working as a waiter. "In the United States, opportunities don't always come the way we expect," Tyrone replied diplomatically. The answer resonated with the French tourists, who were familiar with the struggles of immigration and prejudice in their own countries. They left an even more generous tip than the Japanese guests had and asked to commend the management for the exceptional service. Brandon forced a smile when the tourists approached him, but inside he was seething. His authority was being undermined with every compliment Tyrone received. He needed to do something to regain control of the situation. That night, after the restaurant closed, Brandon called Tyrone aside for a private conversation. This time, his approach was different. Instead of direct confrontation, he tried a subtler strategy. "Tyrone, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday," Brandon began, trying to sound conciliatory. "Maybe I was too hard on you. I just never imagined you had that kind of education." Tyrone didn't respond right away. He had known Brandon long enough to realize he never did anything without an ulterior motive. "I'm willing to reconsider some things," Brandon continued. "How about you help me with the foreign customers? I might even arrange some extra compensation for it." The offer sounded generous on the surface, but Tyrone saw the trap. Brandon wanted to use his language skills without giving him proper recognition or a promotion. It was a way to exploit his talent while keeping him in the same low position. "Thanks for the offer," Tyrone said diplomatically, "but I'd rather keep working as usual. I give all customers the same attention whether they're American or foreign." The answer irritated Brandon, who had expected more submission. Tyrone was acting too independently for his liking, and that couldn't continue. In the following days, Brandon began a subtle campaign of sabotage. He assigned Tyrone the worst tables, the toughest shifts, and always found some flaw in his work. When foreign customers arrived, Brandon tried to serve them personally, even though he didn't speak their languages, just to keep Tyrone from shining again. The strategy, however, backfired. Foreign customers grew frustrated with the poor communication and specifically asked to be served by the waiter who spoke their language. Brandon found himself forced to call Tyrone, which only deepened his humiliation. Margaret watched everything with growing concern. She liked Tyrone and could see Brandon was making his life harder. During a break, she approached him in the back room. "Tyrone, can I give you some advice?" she said quietly. "Be careful with Brandon. He's been on edge since that day with the Japanese customers. I've seen him fire people for much less." "I know, Margaret. Thanks for looking out for me," Tyrone replied. "But I can't live in fear. I'm just doing my job." "Do you have family to support?" Margaret asked, genuinely concerned. "My mother. She's sick and needs expensive medication." Tyrone shared a bit of his personal life. "This job is all I have right now." Margaret's heart ached. She had kids Tyrone's age and could imagine the struggle he was facing. She decided she had to help him somehow. "Listen, I know someone who works at a translation company here in ATL. I can talk to her about you, if you'd like," offered Margaret. "I've already tried several translation companies," replied Tyrone. "There's always some obstacle." "But you have all the qualifications," insisted Margaret. "Having qualifications isn't always enough," said Tyrone with a sad smile. "Sometimes what matters is how you look, not what you know." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a new group of customers. This time, they were German businessmen coming to close a deal with a mining company from Georgia. Brandon, determined not to embarrass himself again, decided to attend to them personally. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now back to the story. Tyrone watched from a distance as Brandon tried to communicate with the Germans using broken English mixed with exaggerated gestures. The situation was becoming awkward for everyone involved. The businessman looked confused, and Brandon was visibly sweating. One of the Germans asked something about wine in his native language, but Brandon didn't understand a word. He motioned for Tyrone to come over, but tried to maintain control of the situation. "Tyrone, see if you can figure out what they want," said Brandon, trying to sound authoritative, even in defeat. Tyrone approached and greeted the Germans in fluent German. The relief on their faces was immediate. They began chatting animatedly with Tyrone about wine, German cuisine, and the cultural differences between the United States and Germany. Brandon stood by the table like a lamppost, not understanding a word of the conversation. His frustration was so obvious that even the Germans started to notice. One of them asked Tyrone in German if the manager was all right. "He's a little nervous with international clients," Tyrone replied diplomatically, also in German. The Germans laughed and remarked among themselves about how ironic it was for a fine dining restaurant manager not to speak other languages. Tyrone didn't translate that comment for Brandon, sparing him further humiliation. When dinner ended, the Germans effusively praised Tyrone's service and left their business cards. They represented a major import-export company and said they'd like to recommend the restaurant to other German executives visiting Atlanta. "But only if we're served by this young man," one of them told Brandon, pointing at Tyrone. Brandon forced a smile and agreed, but inside he was boiling with anger. Every success of Tyrone's felt like a personal defeat, a blow to his authority and competence. That night, Brandon stayed late at the restaurant, drinking alone and stewing in his frustration. How had things come to this? Just a week ago, Tyrone was just another waiter he could humiliate whenever he wanted. Now the most important customers were specifically asking for him. The restaurant phone rang. It was the owner, Mr. Richard Thompson, who lived in New York and rarely got involved in the day-to-day management of the Skyline restaurant. "Brandon, I've received some very positive feedback about one of our waiters," said Mr. Thompson. "A Tyrone who apparently speaks multiple languages. Customers are raving about his service." Brandon's stomach twisted. The news had reached the owner. "Yes, sir. Tyrone is a good employee," Brandon replied, trying to sound neutral. "Great. I want you to take good care of him. Employees like that are rare," said Mr. Thompson. Maybe we should consider a promotion, some special recognition. I'll assess the situation, sir, Brandon said, even though the last thing he wanted was to promote Tyrone. After hanging up, Brandon slammed his fist on the table. Everything was spiraling out of control. He needed to find a way to get rid of Tyrone before the situation got even worse. The next day, Brandon arrived at the restaurant with a plan. He had spent the night thinking of a way to discredit Tyrone and regain his authority. The opportunity came when he learned that an important delegation of foreign ambassadors would be dining at the restaurant that evening. It was a high-profile event, organized by the Atlanta city government to promote tourism in the city. Ambassadors from various countries, local business people, and city officials would be in attendance. It was exactly the kind of event where Brandon could shine and show his competence as manager. "Tyrone, today you'll be working in the back," Brandon announced that morning. "This event is very important, and I need my best waitstaff in the dining room." The statement was obviously a lie. Brandon wanted to keep Tyrone away from the ambassadors to prevent him from standing out again. Tyrone understood the maneuver perfectly, but didn't protest. He needed the job and couldn't afford to openly confront the manager. Margaret watched the situation with indignation. She knew Tyrone was the most qualified employee to handle an international delegation, but Brandon was letting his ego override common sense. "This isn't right," she murmured to Betty during the event preparations. "Brandon's jealous," Betty replied. "I've never seen him so worked up over an employee." The event began at 8 in the evening. The main dining room of the Skyline restaurant was decorated with flowers, and the tables were elegantly arranged. The ambassadors arrived with their entourages, representing countries like France, Germany, Japan, Italy, and Spain. Brandon was nervous but confident. He had rehearsed a few basic English phrases and planned to use his experience as manager to impress the guests. What he didn't expect was the complexity of the event's language needs. Problems arose within the first few minutes. The French ambassador wanted specific information about menu ingredients due to food allergies. The German representative had questions about the available American wines. The Japanese diplomat needed explanations about regional Georgian dishes. Brandon tried to handle the situations using broken English mixed with gestures, but communication was failing. The ambassadors began showing signs of impatience and discomfort. In the back, Tyrone overheard the worried comments from the other waitstaff about the difficulties in the dining room. They came to pick up dishes and returned reporting that Brandon was visibly flustered, and the ambassadors seemed dissatisfied. "Tyrone, can't you help?" Betty asked desperately. "Brandon's making a mess of things and the ambassadors are getting upset." "I can't leave the back without permission," Tyrone replied. "Manager's orders." The situation in the dining room worsened by the minute. The Italian ambassador had asked about the origin of the cheeses being served, but Brandon couldn't explain properly. The Spanish representative wanted to know about Georgia's culinary traditions, but the language barrier prevented a smooth conversation. Then came the most embarrassing moment of the night. The Japanese ambassador, trying to be polite, made a comment in Japanese about the quality of the food. Brandon, not understanding a word, repeatedly replied "arigato" and gave exaggerated bows. What Brandon didn't know was that the ambassador had actually offered constructive criticism about the seasoning of a specific dish. By repeatedly saying "thank you," Brandon not only showed he didn't understand Japanese, but also that he didn't care about the guests' feedback. The ambassador was visibly offended and remarked to his aides in Japanese about the lack of professionalism in the service. Other ambassadors began to notice the tension, and the atmosphere of the event quickly deteriorated. Margaret, observing everything from the reception area, made a decision. She couldn't stand by and watch the restaurant be humiliated on such an important occasion. She headed to the kitchen and looked for Tyrone. "Tyrone, you need to come to the dining room," she said urgently. "Brandon is making a fool of himself, and the ambassadors are getting upset." "Margaret, he ordered me to stay here," Tyrone replied. "If I disobey, he could fire me on the spot." "And if you do nothing, the restaurant will become a joke in the diplomatic community," Margaret shot back. "Think about your mother, her medications. If the Skyline loses its reputation, we could all lose our jobs." Tyrone hesitated. Margaret was right about the consequences, but disobeying Brandon was a huge risk. On the other hand, watching the restaurant where he had worked for 3 years be humiliated on an international stage was painful. Just then, Betty rushed into the kitchen with tears in her eyes. "Guys, the French ambassador asked to speak to the owner," she said desperately. "He's complaining about the service. Brandon is practically shaking with nerves." Tyrone made his decision. He took off his kitchen apron, straightened his uniform, and walked determinedly toward the main dining room. He knew he was risking his job, but he couldn't let the situation keep getting worse. When he entered the dining room, Tyrone quickly assessed the scene. Brandon was visibly sweating, trying to converse with the French ambassador in broken English. The other diplomats were whispering among themselves with uncomfortable expressions. Tyrone took a deep breath and approached the French ambassador's table. He gave a respectful bow and said in perfect French, "Good evening, Your Excellency. I apologize for the confusion. Allow me to properly present our menu and clarify any questions you have about the ingredients and preparation of our dishes." The silence that followed was absolute. Brandon stopped mid-sentence in English and stared at Tyrone in sheer panic. The ambassadors looked up in surprise, and the Frenchman smiled for the first time that evening. "Finally, someone who speaks our language properly," the French ambassador said, clearly relieved. Tyrone spent the next hour moving between tables, speaking to each ambassador in their native tongue. He explained the menu in detail, the history of the regional dishes, the origin of the ingredients, and even aspects of Georgia's culture that made the dining experience unique. With the German ambassador, he discussed Georgia's brewing traditions and made respectful comparisons to German culture. With the Italian representative, he explained the influence of Italian immigration on local cuisine. With the Japanese diplomat, he formally apologized for the earlier misunderstanding and properly clarified questions about seasonings. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, back to the story. Brandon watched everything frozen. Every word Tyrone spoke in different languages was like a dagger to his pride. His incompetence was being exposed in the most humiliating way possible, in front of the most important people who had ever visited the restaurant. The worst was yet to come. The Spanish ambassador, impressed by Tyrone's fluency, asked about his education. Tyrone modestly explained that he had studied linguistics in university and worked in translation before coming to the restaurant. "What a waste," the German ambassador remarked. "Someone with your qualifications should be working in international relations, not waiting tables." In the United States, career paths sometimes take unexpected turns, Tyrone replied diplomatically. The ambassadors understood the underlying message. They were familiar with the realities of prejudice and the challenges talented individuals face in various countries. Tyrone's story moved them deeply. Brandon tried to regain control by moving closer to the tables, but the ambassadors barely noticed him. They were entirely focused on their conversations with Tyrone, who displayed not only linguistic skill but also exceptional cultural and diplomatic knowledge. When the event ended, the outcome was devastating for Brandon. Each ambassador made a point to praise Tyrone specifically and asked for his contact information. The French ambassador said he would recommend the Skyline restaurant to other diplomats, but only if Tyrone was handling the service. The German representative was even more direct. He handed Tyrone his business card and mentioned that his company was looking for skilled translators for business dealings in the United States. The Japanese ambassador remarked that Tyrone would always be welcome at the consulate if he ever wanted to explore opportunities in international relations. Brandon watched it all unfold, feeling smaller by the minute. His authority had been completely undermined, his competence publicly questioned, and his future at the restaurant put at risk. When the last ambassador left, Brandon was visibly shaken. "Tyrone, my office now," he said, his voice trembling with anger. Tyrone followed the manager, knowing he would face the consequences of disobeying orders. The other staff members watched nervously, worried about their colleague's fate. Once in the office, Brandon exploded. "How dare you disrespect me like that? I told you to stay in the kitchen." "The restaurant was struggling," Tyrone replied calmly. "I thought I should help." You humiliated me in front of the ambassadors, Brandon shouted. Who do you think you are? Just an employee who speaks a few languages, Tyrone said. I didn't mean to undermine you. A few languages? Brandon let out a bitter laugh. You speak German, French, Japanese, Italian, Spanish. What else are you hiding from me? Tyrone hesitated before answering. Brandon's question touched a deep wound. For 3 years he had hidden his true education, his skills, his professional dreams, all out of fear of prejudice and the desperate need to keep his job. I also speak English, Mandarin and Russian, Tyrone said quietly. Brandon's legs nearly gave out. 8 languages. Tyrone spoke 8 languages fluently and had worked as a waiter for 3 years without anyone knowing. The revelation was surreal. Why did you never say anything? Brandon asked, his voice quieter now. Because you never cared to know who I really was, Tyrone replied sadly. From day one, you only saw me as a black waiter who needed to stay in his place. The words hit Brandon like a punch. It was true. He had never taken an interest in Tyrone's background or past. He had judged him solely on appearance and social standing. But I'm not prejudiced, Brandon tried to defend himself. 3 years of comments about my intelligence, Tyrone said. 3 years of treating me like I couldn't grasp basic things. 3 years of humiliating me in front of customers. What do you call that? Brandon had no answer. Memories of his cruel remarks came flooding back. Every time he had doubted Tyrone's intelligence, every joke at his expense, every unnecessary moment of humiliation. I'm going to have to let you go, Brandon finally said, trying to regain some control. Why? Asked Tyrone. For saving the restaurant's reputation, for keeping the Skyline restaurant from becoming a joke in the diplomatic community. For disobedience, replied Brandon, but his voice lacked conviction. All right, said Tyrone with resignation. I expected this. 3 years trying to stay invisible, trying not to make waves, just doing my job. But in the end, no matter what I do, I'll always just be a black waiter who doesn't know his place. Tyrone stood up to leave, but Brandon stopped him. Wait, this isn't how things are going to end. How then? Asked Tyrone, turning to face the manager. Brandon hesitated. His anger was giving way to something more complicated. Shame, maybe, or the belated recognition of his own mediocrity in the face of Tyrone's talent. I need to think, said Brandon. Go home. We'll talk again tomorrow. Tyrone nodded and left the office, leaving Brandon alone with his conflicting thoughts. The night had changed everything. There was no going back or pretending nothing had happened. The next day, Tyrone arrived at work unsure what to expect. The other staff greeted him warmly and with admiration. Everyone had heard about his performance with the ambassadors, and he'd become something of a local hero. Tyrone, you were amazing last night, said Betty. I've never seen the ambassadors so impressed with our service. Brandon's going to have to swallow his pride, remarked Margaret. After last night, there's no denying you're the best employee we have here. But Tyrone wasn't so optimistic. He knew Brandon well enough to realize he wouldn't easily accept having his authority challenged. Some kind of retaliation was coming. His suspicions were confirmed when Brandon arrived at the restaurant with a grim expression. He avoided Tyrone all morning, but the tension in the air was palpable. During lunch, a Swiss couple walked into the restaurant. Brandon, determined to prove he was still in control, decided to serve them personally. He approached their table and tried to communicate in basic English. The Swiss, however, spoke German as their first language and struggled with English. The communication was clearly failing, but Brandon insisted on handling it alone. Tyrone watched from a distance as the situation worsened. Tyrone, can you help with these customers? Betty asked discreetly. Brandon said no, Tyrone replied. After last night, he doesn't want me near foreign guests. The situation at the Swiss couple's table was becoming awkward. They wanted specific details about gluten-free dishes, but Brandon couldn't explain properly. The couple was growing impatient. Then, something unexpected happened. The restaurant phone rang and Margaret answered. On the other end was Mr. Richard, the owner, calling from New York. Margaret, I need to speak to Brandon right away, said Mr. Richard. I got some very interesting calls this morning. Margaret called Brandon over, who left the confused Swiss couple to take the call. The conversation was brief, but Tyrone saw Brandon's expression shift gradually from nervousness to sheer panic. "Yes, sir, understood." "Of course, sir," Brandon repeated, hearing something he clearly didn't like. When he hung up, Brandon was visibly shaken. He returned to the Swiss couple's table, but his focus was completely gone. He tried answering their questions, but was visibly distracted and flustered. Tyrone kept watching and noticed the Swiss couple was getting genuinely upset. They had stood up and seemed ready to leave. It was a situation that could lead to a formal complaint and damage the restaurant's reputation. At that moment, Tyrone made a decision. Regardless of the consequences, he couldn't allow customers to leave unsatisfied due to poor communication. He approached the table and greeted the couple in German. The reaction was immediate. The Swiss couple smiled in relief and began chatting animatedly with Tyrone. He explained all the menu options suited to their dietary needs and even gave recommendations for other restaurants in the city they might enjoy. Brandon watched everything, frozen. After his conversation with Mr. Richard, he knew he couldn't interfere. The Swiss guests were so pleased that they asked to speak to the manager to praise Tyrone's service. "Your employee is exceptional," the man told Brandon in English. "We rarely encounter such skilled service on our international travels." Brandon forced a smile and thanked them, but inside, he was devastated. Every compliment for Tyrone felt like a personal humiliation. When the Swiss couple left, Brandon called Tyrone into the office again. This time, however, his approach was different. He seemed defeated, without the aggression from previous days. "Tyrone, I just spoke with Mr. Richard," Brandon said, avoiding eye contact. "He received calls from 3 embassies praising your service yesterday." Tyrone stayed silent, waiting to see where the conversation was going. "The German ambassador called Mr. Richard personally," Brandon continued. "He said he'd never encountered such professional service in American establishments. He wants to make Skyline Restaurant the official venue for embassy events." The news was impressive, but Tyrone remained cautious. He knew Brandon well enough to expect a twist. "That's good for the restaurant," Tyrone said diplomatically. "Mr. Richard wants to come to Atlanta in person next week," Brandon said. "He wants to meet you and discuss some changes to the restaurant's structure." Tyrone felt a chill in his stomach. Changes could mean anything, from a promotion to a disguised dismissal. "What kind of changes?" Tyrone asked. "He didn't go into details," Brandon replied, but his expression suggested he knew more than he was saying. "He only mentioned that employees like you are rare and that we need to properly value that kind of talent." In the following days, the atmosphere in the restaurant shifted completely. Brandon avoided direct confrontations with Tyrone, but his suppressed hostility was palpable. The other staff noticed the tension and began speculating about what would happen when Mr. Richard arrived. Margaret, always well informed about the restaurant's inner workings, pulled Tyrone aside during a break. "Tyrone, I need to tell you something," she said discreetly. "Last night I overheard Brandon making a strange call." "What kind of call?" Tyrone asked. "He was talking to someone about you," Margaret said, "trying to dig up information about your personal life, your past jobs. It sounded like he was looking for something to use against you." The revelation worried Tyrone. He knew Brandon wouldn't easily accept having his authority challenged, but he hadn't imagined the manager would go as far as investigating his private life. "Margaret, are you sure?" Tyrone asked. "Absolutely," she replied. "And there's more. He mentioned something about your academic background, like he was trying to find some irregularity." Tyrone felt a pang of anxiety. His credentials were legitimate, his degrees real, but he knew determined people could always find ways to cast doubt. That night, Tyrone returned to his small studio in Bankhead, feeling uneasy. His modest apartment had never felt so fragile. If he lost his job at the Skyline Restaurant, he wouldn't be able to pay the rent or buy his mother's medicine. Miss Dorothy noticed her son's worry as soon as he walked in. "What's wrong, son?" she asked, studying his tense expression. "Trouble at work, Mum," Tyrone replied, not wanting to burden her with details. "That arrogant manager again?" Miss Dorothy asked. Even sick, she was sharp, and knew Tyrone was struggling at the restaurant. "Something like that," Tyrone said. "But don't worry, I'll figure it out." Miss Dorothy held her son's hand gently. "Tyrone, I know you hide a lot from me to spare my worry," she said. "But I want you to know how proud I am of you. You studied so hard, graduated with top marks, speak all those languages. One day, you'll get the recognition you deserve." His mother's words touched Tyrone deeply. For 3 years he'd felt like a failure, a college graduate working as a waiter. But Miss Dorothy always reminded him there was no shame in honest work, no matter the job. The next day, Tyrone arrived at work determined to face whatever Brandon threw his way. His education was solid, his work impeccable, and his conscience clear. There was nothing the manager could use against him. But Brandon had other plans. That morning he gathered some senior staff trying to sow distrust toward Tyrone. "Don't you think it's strange?" Brandon said to Betty and 2 waiters. "A guy with all that education working here for 3 years without saying a word? That's not normal. He must be hiding something." "Maybe he just needed the job," Betty replied, defending Tyrone. "No one hides 8 languages for 3 years just because they need a job," Brandon insisted. "There's more to this story." The seeds of doubt began to take root. Some employees, swayed by Brandon's comments, started eyeing Tyrone with suspicion. It wasn't open hostility, but a subtle unease that made the workplace uncomfortable. Tyrone noticed the shift but stayed focused on his work. He served customers with the same dedication as always, yet he felt the weight of his co-workers' stares and whispers. Things got worse when Brandon spread rumors that Tyrone might be lying about his academic background. He suggested it was impossible for someone so qualified to work as a waiter for so long. "There must be something in his record," Brandon told Margaret. "Maybe he was fired for cause from his last job." Margaret, who had always stood up for Tyrone, grew confused by Brandon's constant insinuations. She liked Tyrone, but the manager's doubts were getting to her. Tyrone noticed Margaret's change in attitude and was hurt. For 3 years, she'd been like an older sister to him. Seeing her trust shaken by malicious gossip was especially painful. The tension peaked when Mr. Richard confirmed his visit for that Friday. Brandon saw it as his last chance to turn things in his favor. "When Mr. Richard gets here, I'll have a frank talk with him about Tyrone," Brandon told Betty. "I'm sure there's something we don't know about his past." Betty felt uneasy about the conversation. Despite all of Brandon's hints, she couldn't believe Tyrone was dishonest. She'd worked with him for 3 years and always saw him as upright and hard-working. On Thursday, the day before Mr. Richard's visit, an incident occurred that would change everything. During dinner, a group of Chinese businessmen interested in investing in mining in Georgia arrived at the restaurant. Brandon, determined to prove his worth before the owner's arrival, decided to attend to them personally. He approached the table and tried to communicate using basic English mixed with gestures. The Chinese, however, spoke Mandarin as their primary language and struggled greatly with English. The situation quickly became awkward, with Brandon attempting to explain the menu through clumsy pantomiming. Tyrone watched from a distance as the communication completely fell apart. The Chinese businessmen seemed irritated and confused, and Brandon was visibly desperate. Then, one of the Chinese men asked something in Mandarin that sounded like a complaint. Brandon, not understanding a word, repeatedly replied, "Yes, yes," nodding his head exaggeratedly. What Brandon didn't know was that the businessman had asked if the restaurant had any staff who spoke Chinese because communication was impossible. By saying yes without understanding the question, Brandon had created an expectation he couldn't fulfill. The Chinese waited for someone who spoke Mandarin to appear, but Brandon kept trying to communicate in broken English. The situation was becoming ridiculous, and other customers began watching the confusion. Tyrone made a decision. Regardless of the consequences, he couldn't let the restaurant be embarrassed again. He approached the table and greeted the Chinese businessmen in fluent Mandarin. The reaction was explosive. The Chinese were thrilled to finally find someone who spoke their language properly. They began chatting animatedly with Tyrone about business, Chinese culture, and investment opportunities in the United States. Brandon stood frozen, watching Tyrone converse fluently in Mandarin. It was his 9th confirmed language, a skill that made the manager's incompetence with international clients even more glaring. The Chinese businessmen were so impressed, they asked to meet the restaurant's owner. They wanted to make the Skyline restaurant the official venue for their business dinners in Atlanta, but only if Tyrone was in charge of service. "This young man is a treasure," one of the businessmen told Brandon in English. "We rarely find someone who understands our culture and business so well." Brandon forced a smile, but inside, he was devastated. It was the last straw. After Mandarin, how many other languages did Tyrone still hide? How many more humiliations would he have to endure? When the Chinese left, exchanging contacts and promises to return, Brandon was visibly shaken. His strategy to discredit Tyrone had completely backfired. In fact, every attempt to undermine the waiter only highlighted his exceptional talent more. That night, Brandon stayed late at the restaurant, drinking and stewing in his frustration. Tomorrow, Mr. Richard would arrive and see with his own eyes the glaring difference in competence between him and Tyrone. His career as manager was over. That's when he had a desperate idea. If he couldn't discredit Tyrone through rumors about his past, maybe he could create a situation where the waiter seemed unfit for the job. It was risky, but Brandon was desperate. On Friday morning, Mr. Richard arrived at the Skyline restaurant at 10 o'clock. He was a 60-year-old man, elegant and observant, who had built a culinary empire through attention to detail and valuing exceptional employees. Brandon greeted him with poorly concealed nervousness, trying to show control of the situation. He gave a tour of the restaurant, explaining routines and introducing the staff. "Where's Tyrone?" Mr. Richard asked after the introductions. "I've heard very positive comments about him." "He's in the break room, sir," replied Brandon. "I thought I'd introduce him later during lunch." Mr. Richard nodded, but Tyrone could tell the owner was scrutinizing everything with a critical eye. This wasn't just a courtesy visit, it was a full evaluation of operations. Throughout the morning, Mr. Richard discreetly observed the dynamics among the staff. He noticed the tension between Brandon and Tyrone, how other employees looked at the waiter with a mix of admiration and wariness. By noon, the first lunch customers arrived. Brandon had prepared a careful demonstration, selecting specific tables to showcase his competence as manager. But fate had other plans. At 12:30, a Russian couple walked into the restaurant, clearly struggling with English. Mr. Richard watched as Brandon approached to serve them. Communication was a disaster from the start. Brandon tried using English, but the Russians responded in their native language. Frustration was evident on both sides, and the situation was growing awkward. Mr. Richard observed everything with increasing attention. As the owner of international restaurants, he knew the importance of proper communication with foreign guests. What he was seeing didn't match the reputation Skyline restaurant had built. Then Tyrone quietly appeared beside the table and greeted the couple in flawless Russian. The transformation was immediate. The Russians smiled in relief and began chatting animatedly with Tyrone about the menu and wine selections. Mr. Richard was impressed, not just by the fluency, but by Tyrone's professionalism. He had identified the problem and resolved it without drama or publicly undermining Brandon. Throughout the service, Tyrone demonstrated not just language skills, but deep knowledge of cuisine, wine, and hospitality. Mr. Richard watched every move, every interaction, every genuine smile Tyrone offered the guests. Brandon, meanwhile, tried to save face, but it was clear he had completely lost control of the situation. Mr. Richard was witnessing firsthand the stark difference in competence between manager and waiter. When the Russian couple left, extremely satisfied, leaving a generous tip, Mr. Richard called Tyrone over. "Tyrone, could you join us?" he said, gesturing to a reserved table in the corner. Tyrone approached nervously, unsure what to expect. Brandon was visibly tense, realizing his attempt to impress the owner had failed miserably. "How many languages do you speak?" Mr. Richard asked directly. "9, sir," Tyrone answered honestly. "English, Spanish, French, Italian, German, Japanese, Mandarin, Russian, and Portuguese." Mr. Richard paused, processing this. 9 languages was extraordinary, especially for an employee working as a waiter. "What's your academic background?" he asked next, linguistics with a specialization in simultaneous interpretation from Georgia State University, Tyrone replied. I also have a certification in international relations. Why are you working as a waiter? Mr. Richard pressed, getting straight to the point. Tyrone hesitated. This was the question he'd feared for 3 years, the one that exposed his vulnerability and the hardships he'd faced. I lost my last job when the translation company shut down during the recession, he explained. I spent months looking for another opportunity in the field, but sometimes it's hard to get a chance to prove yourself when people judge based on appearances. The answer was honest and painful. Mr. Richard understood immediately what Tyrone meant, without him having to spell out the prejudice he'd faced. And why did you stay here for 3 years without mentioning your qualifications? Asked Mr. Richard. Because I needed the job, Tyrone replied simply. My mother is sick, the medications are expensive, and I couldn't afford to be picky. Honest work is honest work, no matter the position. Mr. Richard looked at Brandon, who was visibly uncomfortable with the conversation. The owner was an experienced man and could easily read the toxic dynamic that had developed in the restaurant. Brandon, did you know about Tyrone's background? Asked Mr. Richard. I found out recently, sir, Brandon replied, trying to downplay his guilt. He never mentioned it before. And when you found out, what was your reaction? Pressed Mr. Richard. Brandon hesitated, realizing he was in a tough spot. Any answer could dig him deeper. I was surprised, of course, Brandon said carefully. It's unusual to find someone with so many qualifications working as a waiter. Mr. Richard wasn't satisfied with the evasive answer. As an experienced owner, he knew there was much more to the story than was being said. Tyrone, would you excuse us for a moment? Asked Mr. Richard. I need to speak with Brandon about some administrative matters. Tyrone stepped out, leaving the two men alone. Mr. Richard waited until he was sure they wouldn't be overheard before speaking. Brandon, I'll be direct, said Mr. Richard. I've received calls from 3 embassies specifically praising Tyrone. The German ambassador wants to make Skyline Restaurant the embassy's official dining spot, but only if Tyrone is handling service. Brandon swallowed hard, knowing there was no defense for what was coming. During my visit today, I observed the dynamic between you two, Mr. Richard continued. It's clear there's tension, and it's also clear Tyrone is underutilized in this role. Sir, I can explain, Brandon tried. No need to explain, Mr. Richard interrupted. You need to listen. Employees like Tyrone are rare. Someone with 9 languages, solid academic training, and 3 years of dedication is a treasure any establishment should value. Brandon stayed silent, knowing his career was being decided at that moment. What worries me most, said Mr. Richard, is that for 3 years, Tyrone hid his qualifications. That only happens in environments where employees don't feel safe to show their true potential. The observation was devastating. Mr. Richard had pinpointed the exact problem, a toxic environment wasting talent due to prejudice and poor management. I'll be clear, Brandon, said Mr. Richard. Tyrone will be promoted to International Relations Manager. It's a position I'm creating specifically for him, focused on serving foreign clients and developing partnerships with embassies and multinational companies. Brandon felt his world crumble. Not only would Tyrone not be fired, but he'd be promoted to a high-profile position in the restaurant. What about me, sir? Brandon asked weakly. You'll remain as general manager, but reporting directly to me, said Mr. Richard. And you'll need to work closely with Tyrone. If that's a problem for you, we can discuss other options. The message was clear. Accept the new structure or find another job. Brandon had no choice but to agree. Understood, sir, Brandon said, defeated. Mr. Richard called Tyrone back to announce the decision. The look of shock and gratitude on the new international relations manager's face was touching. Tyrone, I want to make your promotion official, announced Mr. Richard. Starting Monday, you'll be our international relations manager, with a salary and benefits fitting the position. Tyrone was speechless. For 3 years, he had dreamed of an opportunity to use his qualifications properly. Now, finally, his talent would be valued. Thank you, sir, Tyrone said emotionally. I won't let you down. I'm sure you won't, Mr. Richard replied with a smile. I expect great things from this partnership. The news of Tyrone's promotion spread quickly through the restaurant. Reactions were mixed. Some employees were genuinely happy for him, while others showed envy or resentment. Margaret was one of the first to congratulate him. She felt guilty for doubting him during Brandon's smear campaign. "Tyrone, forgive me for believing those lies Brandon was spreading," she said sincerely. "I should have trusted you." "It's all right, Margaret," Tyrone replied generously. "I understand it was a confusing situation for everyone." Betty also came over to congratulate Tyrone, but her reaction was more reserved. She was happy for him, but also worried about the changes to come. "You're still going to be the same Tyrone, right?" she asked, half joking, half serious. "Of course," Tyrone replied. "A promotion doesn't change who I am." But not everyone was happy with the changes. Some of the older waitstaff resented that Tyrone had been promoted over them, especially since they had always seen him as just another co-worker. "3 years pretending to be a regular waiter," one muttered to another. "Seems like he was fooling us the whole time." Tyrone overheard the comment and felt a pang of sadness. Even with the promotion and recognition, there were still those who questioned his integrity. He realized that big changes always bring resistance, even when they're positive. Tyrone's first week as International Relations Manager was intense. Mr. Richard had given clear instructions about his responsibilities, developing partnerships with embassies, creating a specialized service program for foreign clients, and training other employees in international protocol. Tyrone threw himself into the work with enthusiasm. Finally, he could use all his skills properly. He started by developing a multilingual menu, creating specific protocols for different cultures, and establishing contacts with local embassies. Brandon, meanwhile, struggled to accept the new reality. Watching Tyrone lead meetings, make important decisions, and earn respect from influential clients was a constant blow to his ego. Things got more complicated when Tyrone began implementing service changes. He suggested cultural sensitivity training for all employees and proposed menu adjustments to accommodate different religious and cultural dietary restrictions. "Are these changes really necessary?" Brandon questioned during a meeting. "We never had problems before." "Unreported problems don't mean they didn't exist," Tyrone replied diplomatically. "Now we have the chance to be truly inclusive." The answer irritated Brandon, who saw every one of Tyrone's suggestions as an implicit criticism of his past management. The tension between them remained high, even with the new hierarchy in place. Tyrone's first major test in his new position came when the German embassy organized a special event at the Skyline restaurant. It was a celebratory dinner attended by German and American business people, diplomats, and local officials. Tyrone personally oversaw every detail. He prepared customized menus, trained staff on German etiquette, and even arranged a small cultural program with American music appropriate for the occasion. Brandon watched the preparations with growing unease. The success of the event would solidify Tyrone's position once and for all, while any misstep could be seen as justification to question his promotion. On the night of the event, everything went perfectly. Tyrone moved effortlessly between groups of Germans and Americans, facilitating business conversations and ensuring everyone felt comfortable. His cultural fluency proved just as important as his linguistic skills. The German ambassador made a point to publicly praise the event's organization and announced that the embassy would formalize an official partnership with the Skyline restaurant for future events. "This is exactly the kind of professionalism we expect in our partnerships," the ambassador told Mr. Richard. "Tyrone is a valuable addition to your team." Brandon watched the praise with a mix of anger and resignation. It was undeniable that Tyrone had completely transformed the restaurant's service level for international clients. After the event, Mr. Richard made sure to congratulate Tyrone publicly in front of all the staff. "Today's success proves we made the right decision," Mr. Richard announced. "Tyrone has raised our service standard to an international level." The applause was genuine, but Tyrone noticed Brandon remained silent. The divide among the staff was still evident. Some genuinely supported Tyrone, while others held reservations. In the following weeks, Tyrone continued implementing improvements. He created a cultural exchange program where employees could learn about different countries and customs. He established partnerships with translation companies to serve customers who spoke languages even he didn't master. Each initiative was a success, but it also deepened Brandon's resentment. He felt increasingly marginalized in his own workplace, watching his influence wane as Tyrone took on more responsibilities. The situation reached a breaking point when Tyrone suggested creating a language training program for interested employees. The idea was to offer basic classes in English, Spanish, and French to improve the restaurant's overall service. "We don't have the budget for this," Brandon protested during the planning meeting. "Mr. Richard already approved the budget," Tyrone replied calmly. "The classes will be voluntary and held outside work hours." Brandon felt completely excluded from major decisions. Tyrone was communicating directly with Mr. Richard, cutting him out of the process. "Why wasn't I consulted about this?" Brandon asked, trying to maintain his composure. "You were included in all the email communications," Tyrone responded, showing the sent messages. "Maybe you missed them because you were focused on other tasks." Tyrone's diplomatic answer only irritated Brandon further. He knew he was being gradually sidelined from important decisions, but couldn't openly protest without seeming petty. The training program launched with great enthusiasm. 10 employees signed up for the language classes, including Margaret and Betty. Tyrone organized the groups and began teaching personally, once again demonstrating his teaching skills. During the lessons, Tyrone didn't just teach vocabulary and grammar. He also shared insights about different cultures. The employees were impressed by his ability to make learning engaging and relevant to their work. "Tyrone is a born teacher," Betty remarked after the first class. "I never thought learning French could be so fun." "He should have been a college professor," Margaret said. "It's a waste to have so much talent working just at a restaurant." The comments reached Tyrone's ears, and he was touched by his colleagues' admiration. For 3 years he had hidden his talents. Now at last he could share them and see the positive impact on others. Brandon, however, saw the training program as yet another display of Tyrone's superiority. Every success of the new manager felt like a personal humiliation. The situation grew even more complicated when Tyrone started receiving invitations to speak about international hospitality. A local university asked him to give a talk on multicultural service in dining establishments. "Will this affect your work schedule?" Brandon asked, trying to find a way to object. "The talks will be on weekends," Tyrone replied, "and Mr. Richard has already approved my participation. In fact, he thinks it'll be great publicity for the restaurant." Once again, Brandon felt left out of important decisions. Tyrone was becoming a public figure, representing the Skyline restaurant at academic and professional events. Tyrone's first talk was a resounding success. He spoke about his experience as a multilingual waiter and how cultural diversity could transform dining establishments. The audience was captivated by his personal story and innovative ideas. After the talk, several students approached him with questions and asked for career advice in international hospitality. Tyrone felt fulfilled, knowing he could inspire others facing similar challenges. The impact of the talk exceeded expectations. Local newspapers published articles about Tyrone and his story of overcoming adversity. The Skyline restaurant began to be mentioned as an example of inclusion and diversity in the dining industry. Mr. Richard was thrilled with the positive publicity. He personally called Tyrone to congratulate him on his exceptional representation of the restaurant. "Tyrone, you're taking our brand to a level I never imagined," Mr. Richard said. "I'm considering expanding your role to other restaurants in the chain." The possibility of national expansion excited Tyrone, but also worried him. He loved the work he was doing at the Skyline and didn't want to leave the team that had become his second family. When Brandon heard about Tyrone's potential promotion, he panicked. If Tyrone moved into a national role, he himself might lose relevance in Mr. Richard's restaurant chain. That night, Brandon made a desperate decision. He called Mr. Richard and requested a private meeting to discuss important matters regarding the restaurant's management. "Mr. Richard, I need to talk about some concerns I have regarding Tyrone," Brandon said during the call. "What kind of concerns?" Mr. Richard asked, surprised. "I'd rather discuss it in person," Brandon replied. These are delicate issues that could affect the restaurant's reputation. Mr. Richard agreed to the meeting, but was puzzled by Brandon's mysterious tone. What problems could there possibly be with Tyrone, who had only brought success and recognition to the business? The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Brandon spent the weekend preparing arguments and searching for flaws in Tyrone's work that might justify his concerns. But Tyrone remained impeccable in his duties. Every event he organized was a success. Every foreign customer left satisfied. Every improvement initiative yielded positive results. On Monday, a group of Japanese businessmen arrived at the restaurant without a reservation. It was the perfect test for the emergency service protocol Tyrone had developed. Not only did Tyrone manage to accommodate the group immediately, but he also arranged a special menu tailored to Japanese culinary preferences. The businessmen were so impressed they asked to speak with the owner. "This is the best service we've received in the United States," the group leader told Mr. Richard over the phone. "Tyrone understands our culture exceptionally well." When Brandon found out about yet another one of Tyrone's successes, he realized his strategy to discredit him was doomed to fail. There was no way to criticize someone whose work was consistently outstanding. On Tuesday, during the meeting with Mr. Richard, Brandon tried a different approach. Instead of attacking Tyrone directly, he questioned whether so many rapid changes were healthy for the restaurant. "Mr. Richard, I'm not questioning Tyrone's competence," Brandon said carefully, "but so many changes might be causing instability among the staff." "What kind of instability?" Mr. Richard asked. "Some employees feel intimidated," Brandon lied. "They think Tyrone is setting impossible standards to keep up with." Mr. Richard wasn't convinced. He had observed the team dynamics and seen how most employees respected and admired Tyrone. "Brandon, I'll be direct," Mr. Richard said. "I get the impression you're uncomfortable with Tyrone's success. That's a professional issue we need to address." The remark hit Brandon like a punch. Mr. Richard had nailed exactly what was going on: personal resentment disguised as professional concern. "That's not it, sir," Brandon tried to defend himself. "I just want what's best for the restaurant." "What's best for the restaurant is recognizing and valuing exceptional talent," Mr. Richard replied. "Tyrone has brought positive changes that have increased our revenue and reputation. Any attempt to sabotage him would harm everyone." The message was clear. Stop trying to undermine Tyrone or face the consequences. Brandon left the meeting knowing he had definitively lost the war against his former subordinate. In the following months, Tyrone continued thriving in his new position. The Skyline restaurant became a benchmark for international hospitality, hosting diplomatic delegations and business people from various countries. Tyrone developed a mentorship program for young people interested in international careers. He partnered with local universities to offer internships at the restaurant. He established protocols that were adopted by other locations in the chain. Brandon, gradually, began to accept the new reality. He realized his initial hostility had been rooted in prejudice and personal insecurity. Tyrone had never tried to humiliate him or take his place. He had simply used his talents when they were recognized. Brandon's transformation was slow, but genuine. He started attending the cultural sensitivity trainings Tyrone offered. He learned about different international protocols and even began studying basic English. "Tyrone, can I talk to you?" Brandon said one afternoon, 6 months after the promotion. "Of course, Brandon," Tyrone replied, surprised by the respectful tone. "I want to apologize," Brandon said, avoiding eye contact, "for 3 years of inappropriate remarks, for how I treated you, for resisting your changes. I was wrong." Tyrone was moved by the sincerity of the apology. It was something he never expected to hear from Brandon. "Thank you for saying that," Tyrone answered. "I know it wasn't easy for you to accept the changes." "The problem was never you," Brandon said. "It was my own insecurity. Seeing someone so qualified made me realize my own limitations." The conversation marked the beginning of a new phase in their relationship. They didn't become close friends, but they developed a mutual professional respect. Tyrone began including Brandon in more decisions, acknowledging his experience in operational management. Brandon, in turn, publicly supported Tyrone's initiatives, and even began advocating for the importance of cultural diversity in customer service. The transformation of the Skyline restaurant was complete, from a place where prejudice limited potential to an establishment internationally recognized for its excellence in multicultural hospitality. Mr. Richard decided to document the restaurant's story as a case study on inclusion and talent appreciation. Tyrone was invited to share the Skyline restaurant's experience at international hospitality conferences. During one of these conferences, Tyrone reflected on his journey. From a waiter hiding his qualifications to a respected international manager, his path showed how properly recognizing talent could transform not just individuals, but entire organizations. The most important lesson, Tyrone said during his presentation, is that exceptional talent can be hidden anywhere. Prejudice and snap judgments keep us from discovering and nurturing that talent. The audience responded with enthusiastic applause. Tyrone's story had become an inspiration for managers worldwide interested in creating truly inclusive environments. Back at the Skyline restaurant, Tyrone continued developing new initiatives. He created a cultural exchange program where employees could visit other countries to learn about different culinary traditions. He partnered with consulates to promote events celebrating Atlanta's cultural diversity. Miss Dorothy, who had significantly recovered with the best treatments Tyrone could now afford, beamed with pride seeing news stories about her son on TV and in the papers. "I always knew you were special," she said during a visit to the restaurant. "I was just waiting for the world to see it too." Tyrone hugged his mother, moved. All the struggles of the past years had been worth it to reach this moment of recognition and professional fulfillment. The Skyline restaurant's team became a family united by diversity and mutual respect. Employees from different backgrounds worked in harmony, each contributing their unique cultural experiences. Margaret had learned basic French and become an expert at serving French-speaking guests. Betty mastered basic Spanish and loved chatting with Latin American tourists. Even some waiters who had initially resisted change embraced the restaurant's new multicultural philosophy. The Skyline's success inspired other establishments in Atlanta to rethink their hiring and employee development practices. The city began to be recognized as a model of international hospitality in the United States. Tyrone, now 32, looked to the future with optimism. He had received offers to work for international organizations, but chose to stay at the Skyline. It was there he had found not just a career, but a purpose. "Why not take those international offers?" Betty asked during one of their language lessons. "Because this is where I can make a real difference," Tyrone replied. "Transforming a place, a team, a community means more to me than any position at some far-off organization." His answer revealed the maturity and wisdom he had gained through his experiences. He had learned that true success wasn't just about personal recognition, but the ability to lift others up with him. Mr. Richard, impressed by Tyrone's consistent results, made an important decision. He promoted him to Director of International Development for the entire restaurant chain, allowing him to implement his ideas on a national scale. "Tyrone, I want you to transform all our establishments the same way you transformed the Skyline restaurant," said Mr. Richard. "You have free rein to develop a national multicultural hospitality program." The promotion represented the highest recognition of his contributions. Tyrone accepted the challenge with enthusiasm, seeing the opportunity to multiply the positive impact he had created in Atlanta. Brandon was promoted to regional manager, overseeing several restaurants under Tyrone's guidance. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. The man who had tried to humiliate Tyrone for 3 years was now working under his leadership, but their relationship had evolved into a genuine partnership. Brandon had become one of the biggest advocates for the inclusion policies Tyrone implemented, recognizing how they improved both the work environment and financial results. During Tyrone's promotion ceremony, Brandon made sure to speak publicly. "Tyrone taught me that real leadership doesn't come from titles or authority, but from competence, respect, and the ability to lift others up. I'm grateful to work with someone who transformed not just this restaurant, but also my way of seeing the world." Brandon's words deeply moved Tyrone. Seeing the genuine transformation of someone who had once been his biggest opponent was perhaps his greatest personal achievement. The story of the Skyline restaurant became a success case studied in universities and companies across the United States. Tyrone was invited to speak about leadership, diversity, and talent development at corporate and academic events. Each presentation reinforced the same message: exceptional talent exists everywhere and at all organizational levels. The key is creating environments where those talents feel safe to emerge and grow. Years later, when Tyrone looked back on his journey, he felt gratitude for every difficult moment he had faced. The prejudice he had endured, the humiliation he had suffered, the nights of uncertainty about the future, it had all helped shape his empathy and determination. The boy who had hidden 9 languages out of fear of not being accepted had become a respected leader who inspired others to embrace their own uniqueness. The waiter who had served tables for 3 years had found a way to serve his community on a much larger scale. Tyrone continued visiting the Skyline restaurant regularly, not just out of professional duty, but out of genuine affection. It was there that he had rediscovered his worth, his dignity, and his potential. It was there that he had learned true recognition doesn't come just from titles or salaries, but from the ability to make a difference in other people's lives. End of story. Now tell us what you thought of this story of perseverance and recognition. Do you believe Tyrone made the right decisions by staying humble even after his promotion? Share your honest thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other inspiring stories like this one.